Hi, my name is Richard, and welcome to the 68th in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history, where we've discussed from the time of the fall of the Sasanian Persian Empire and the significant rout of the Byzantine Empire all the way up to the present. And today we're going to talk about the republics of Egypt, and I say republics because for a certain period of time, this will be called the Arab Republic of Egypt. And after that point, it will be revert to being called the Republic of Egypt without that Arab in front of it. So to capture both of those, I'm using this title. And this session and the session next week will take us from roughly the year 1950 until the present day. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, let me explain the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics we will be discussing today. And this will endeavor to be a secular presentation. There are, of course, multiple sides in the Egyptian political debate, and I'm going to try and present it showing all the sides' benefits and all the sides' flaws. And of course, this, like all other subjects in Middle Eastern history, is controversial. So let's please be respectful. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is that this presentation is a 101 and a 201, by which I mean a 101 in that if you don't know anything, I'm going to catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you already know the basics of what's going on in this period, I'm probably going to tell you something you didn't know. I also have a 2-hour hard stop Eastern time. I will not show any new slides. Those slides will go into next week's presentation. And we will go to the Q&A session where we can talk about different things that have come up during the presentation and so on. But you won't miss anything from having left at that 2-hour mark. I also will put dates below an individual. If it's a political figure, it's usually their date of service and their most important role, be it president, prime minister, king, whatever. And if they are a thought leader, the dates below them are their years of life. And it should be relatively straightforward, which is which, with the exception of certain leaders like Gaddafi. You're not having somebody who's in power for 40 years. So you can sort of see that relationship. And of course, this is being live streamed on YouTube, which means that it will be recorded. And the other 67 episodes of the Middle Eastern Islamic History series are also recorded, so you can compare and contrast this, for example, with episode 59, which was the last time we talked about Egypt, and some of the other episodes that I'm drawing on here, like episode 62, which talks about secularism. And accordingly, you can sort of put these together. And you can also put together all of the other series that you can find all of them on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and see all of the different presentations that we do, not just from my group. Now, I also would say that if you want to be on the Zoom and be able to ask your questions and participate in real time, please join our meetup. And the link is right there. That way you can be part of these discussions. And finally, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube, all of which cost money to keep the lights on. And we really appreciate that if you find what we're doing for free, something that is valuable, something that is helpful, that you give us a little something to show your appreciation. All right. So just to take us through a quick run through Egypt up until 1950, so we remember where we were. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire from about 1517 until 1798. And as part of the Ottoman Empire, it was relegated to sort of this backwater position. And the reason 1798 is so pivotal is that this is when Napoleon invades Egypt, and he begins to create Egyptian consultative bodies, which is really the first time since 1517 that Egyptians, or rather people living in Egypt, are making decisions about what should be happening in Egypt. Now, Napoleon is expelled by the British after the Battle of Alexandria in 1801, and there becomes this period between 1801 and 1805 where different Ottomans, and by Ottomans I mean leaders within that empire who have now taken back the territory, are trying to figure out who will become the leader of Egypt. And that ends up falling to Muhammad Ali, who you can see there in the center. And Muhammad Ali founds the Alawiya dynasty, which survived from 1805 until 1953. And this dynasty it sort of stewards Egypt through the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So what does that mean in terms of the kinds of country that they were created? Now, Muhammad Ali himself was a very forward-thinking individual and a very progressive individual. And we talked, especially in episode 30, about all of the different kinds of reforms that he did to modernize Egypt. In fact, he modernized Egypt to such a degree that it was able to militarily expand. And you can see on this map that Egypt was a country that was able to invade what is today Saudi Arabia in 1818, able to able to participate fully in the Greek independence war. In fact, were it not for British and French intervention in the Greek independence war of 1821 to 1826, the Egyptians likely would have put down the Greek rebellion where the Ottomans could not. And in fact, if we look at the situations in what's today Saudi Arabia, which was the war against Al-Qa'iyya and the defeat of the Greeks, generally speaking, in the Greek independence war, these were battles where the Egyptians were able to effectively control Ottoman territories in a way that the Ottoman Empire could not. And in both cases, it was the Ottomans who had asked the Egyptians to intervene and in the internal politics of their own empire. And of course, you can see that arrow downwards towards the Sudan. Now, the Egyptians conquered the Sudan and effectively turned it into their own colony, where they exported slaves, ivory, gum arabic, and in many ways, they treated the Sudanese people, the indigenous, especially blacks of the Kordofan and of what is today South Sudan, very, very abrasively. As I mentioned, there was a massive slave taking and slave capturing operation that Egypt engaged in. And this period of Sudanese control and imperialism is called the Turkish Sudanese period, because the Alawiya dynasty was ruled by Turkish-speaking Albanians. So you have the creation, in fact, of the modern infrastructure of Sudan really in this period. For example, the capital Khartoum was built by the Egyptians as a way to organize and rule the territory effectively. In fact, it's something that we've seen, generally speaking, with other colonizers. One particular example that I'd like to highlight here is that the capital of Tajikistan, Dushanbe, didn't exist until the Russians actually conquered the territory of Tajikistan and realized that they needed an administrative center in order to govern the territory. And they called the place Dushanbe, which means Monday, because that was the place where Tajiks would come together on Mondays to have a market. And so that was the closest they ever had to a city. And so the Russians built a city there. Khartoum is exactly the same story. Khartoum is on the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which are the two tributaries that become the Nile that flows north from Khartoum into Egypt. And therefore, its strategic location was critical for holding the enterprise together. And the Egyptians were learning from the French, especially Joseph Anton Selve, who was known as Al-Faransawi, the Frenchman, who was a French colonel who assisted the Egyptians in building their modern army and infrastructure. We then sort of talked about how Egypt began to engage in modern and advanced activities through their relations with, at first, the French and then later the British. And we saw that, for example, they're contracting with the French to build the Suez Canal, them sending soldiers to fight in the French invasion of Mexico, which took place in 1863. And in all of these cases, you see a relationship building between Egypt and France, where Egypt becomes increasingly more and more de facto independent and less integrated with the Ottoman Empire, even though de jure, it was still a part of the Ottoman Empire, with all of these leaders being considered governors. Now, I have a question. With cities being founded so much in rivers, and especially at the confluence of rivers, why would there not have been a city already at Khartoum? There were cities in and around the confluence of those two rivers, but to put it exactly where the Egyptians put it would require controlling the river. because the Nile tends to flood. And if you put a city at exactly the confluence of the rivers, they put it literally inside the V, for want of a better term. And so that area would have been prone to flooding if the Egyptians didn't build embankment walls and other sorts of structures. So it wasn't the smart play to put it there from a historic perspective. And so you have a number of Sudanese villages that had existed on either side of the V, right? Like here or here, but they just had never put something in the center. All right. All of this began to change with Ismail, who took the title of Khedive in 1867 and basically declared independence, more or less, from the Ottoman Empire, making Egypt its own governing country. And Ismail did a number of things to improve the functionality of Egypt beyond even what Muhammad Ali and Said Pasha had been able to do before him. He built significant numbers of irrigation canals. He put together telegraph lines. He had his own opera house. He built railroad connections throughout the country. He modernized the port of Alexandria. Significant numbers of developments that would put Egypt, at least theoretically, on equal standing, maybe not with Western European powers, but with smaller Eastern European countries, and was certainly more powerful than any other country in the Middle East or North Africa. But of course, the problem was that Ismail also wanted to militarily expand the territory that Egypt could control. So he expanded into the western part of Sudan, the area called Darfur. He also, if that name sounds familiar, that's because of the recent genocide that took place there. He also expanded into South Sudan and east into Ethiopia, where the Ethiopians handed him several key defeats. And the amount of money that he had to spend in order to achieve those military victories put him in immense debt. And when the British basically called him to account for the fact that he had 96 million pounds of debt, the way that they chose to resolve it was by taking the ownership of the Suez Canal. This was seen as an abject humiliation for Egypt. Egypt had been this powerful country, rising to meet the European levels, rising to meet the New World. In fact, as I pointed out, Ismail had built an opera house. He'd built all the modern European types of accoutrements. You can see his style of dress. He dressed in a British style. But no matter how close he flew, in many ways, Egyptians saw this as an Icarus moment, that the European system was not going to allow them to grow. And we're going to see this sort of view of the West creating this idea that anybody can ascend, but not actually allowing people to ascend. We're going to see it not only in Egypt, we're going to see it through a number of different Middle Eastern countries. And so as a result of Ismail's continuing spending, the British decided to depose him and put in his nephew, Tawfiq, in order to control the country. And they controlled the country through what was called the Veiled Protectorate. So you had Lord Curzon, who was one of the secretaries, Lord Cromer, who was one of the secretaries in charge of managing Egypt during this period where the British didn't have direct rule, but would advise the Sultan very strongly on issues. Lord Cromer was very much a believer in the white man's burden, this idea that Europeans were further along the development of civilization, further along the future of societies. And the British would begrudgingly bring all of these backwards indigenous peoples into the light that they were already living in. And so much of his style of governing Egypt was designed to promote the British hegemony, because that was what would be required initially to bring Egypt along this civilizational development. Now, of course, most Egyptians would argue that the British didn't actually do much that would promote the bringing of civilization to Egypt. for example, one of the things that they tried to do was to prevent Egyptians from getting an education. It was believed, at least by the British, that if the Egyptians began to be more and more educated, they might find new and unique ways to oppose the British. So the education should be limited, closing down schools and increasing tuition. You also had the destruction of Egypt's foremost institution, which was the military. Remember how that military had been built up throughout the 19th century, a military so powerful, it was able to challenge the strength and security. It was able to function as a buffer to Ottoman strength and security in the 18 teens and 1820s. And in fact, we didn't discuss this, but in the 1830s and 1840s, it actually challenged the Ottoman Empire for dominance of the Middle East, only being defeated by a combination of Europeans intervening on the Ottoman side. So you begin to see this fundamental view in Egypt that the purpose of the British and that the purpose of the French, to the extent that the French were part of this colonial action, was to limit Egypt and to make Egypt subservient to them. And so in this period, we begin to see the Nahda, and we've been through the Nahda several different times. This is the Renaissance in Muslim political thought that starts developing in the mid-19th century and continues through to, let's say, the early 20th century. And we mentioned how there was really a divide within the Nahda, within the Arab Renaissance, between two different kinds of political thinkers. On one hand, you had the ethnic nationalists. These were individuals who, genuinely speaking, were trying to create an ethnic affinity group and say that those within the ethnic affinity group are one nation, they should become independent and manifest that. There was the other group, which were the Muslim modernists, and these were individuals who believed that Western liberalism was actually not a Western concept, but an Islamic concept. It had simply never been properly introduced in the Islamic world. But if you were to read the Quran, if you were to read the various exegetical texts throughout the centuries, they would point to a society that is scientifically progressive, that is emancipatory to all of its citizens, that serves in many ways the same function that Westernized democracy would serve for its people. And Islam would be part of the state as a moral guide, not necessarily a direct influence for laws. Think about, for example, in many cases, how Republicans might use Christianity as a basis for their legal thought, but they won't explicitly say, because the Bible says X, X should be law. Now, the Islamic modernists have an incredible amount of success when it comes to Egypt. And in fact, they almost shun the ethnic nationalists out of the debate, and they'll stay out of the debate until the 1950s. So that's why, for example, Muhammad Abduh, who's the largest there, and Rifai Tahtawi were Egyptian. This was a movement that had great resonance for Egyptians, that the Islamic world could achieve modernity through a reinvigoration of its Islamic values. But as you begin to get into the early 20th century and the Ottoman Empire is destroyed, there comes to be this very difficult moment for the Islamic modernists. And they divide really into two camps. And we discussed this a little bit more in detail in episode 62. But these two camps basically try to reconcile this vision of a true Islamic society with the fact that the last serious Islamic theocracy, one that had at least nominally tried to create some of these progressive changes, although Abdul Hamid II undercut that for about 30 years, as we talked about in episode 40-something, 41, I want to say. You had two ways that this broke out in Egypt. The first one was taken by Ali Abdel Razak and Taha Hussein, And these two individuals wrote on the fact that you don't actually need Islamic governance. The values that Islam has imparted to the wider society, the values of tolerance, of education, of personal growth and perseverance, these were values upon which a democracy could be built, a secular state could be built, without recourse to Islam being part of the government. Abdel Nasser is in particular somebody who's interesting because he actually came from the religious establishment. They kicked him out when he wrote his seminal book, A Religion, Not a State, where he talks about the creation of a secular nation state as being fully Islamically compliant. But he came from a religious background, and even he was arguing that religion wasn't a necessary component of state building, which was something that was very difficult for a lot of Middle Easterners to come around to. And then, of course, you had the complete opposite side of the debate, which was chaired by Rashid Reda first, and then later Hassan al-Banna in Egypt. Rashid Reda was living in Syria. But their primary argument was the failure of the Ottoman Empire was not that it was too Muslim, but that it wasn't Muslim enough. It didn't embrace the Islamic identity as a core piece of creating a modern society. And Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is and how it affects Egypt, because it's tightly woven with the future of Egypt here. But the Muslim Brotherhood operated on the supposition that Muslims themselves formed an ethnic group within the understanding of ethnic nationalism, right? Under ethnic nationalism, you have this idea that you have a certain group of people, you can delineate them perhaps by language, perhaps by certain traditions, perhaps by foods that they consume, religion that they happen to belong to. And once you've defined this group of people is an ethnicity, and this ethnicity has its own political intents and desires. Ergo, they are a nation. So the interesting thing with the Muslim Brotherhood is that this had never been done for a religion unless that was a religion that was an ethno-religion, like Judaism. And an ethno-religion is one where the religion doesn't evangelize that much. And so accordingly, the ancestry or fictive kinship holds all those people together. Nobody argues that all Muslims share the same ancestry. But under Hassan al-Banna's rhetoric, the Muslims were a nation, and there should be a Muslim nation in terms of a physical entity, a governmental structure that represented the will of the Muslims, in the same way that we would say that Slovenia represents the will of the Slovene people. You can see how these two political philosophies are at complete odds with one another. In one case, you're trying to create a secular set of institutions that are based on primarily the idea of common people living in a certain area being able to arbitrate their own disputes through an understanding of progressiveness, scientific openness, and mutual respect. And on the other, we're having an idea that morality is the guiding force of society, and that morality will be made manifest by a dominant religious group in the function of an ethnic group. Unfortunately for the Egyptians, neither of these really became the dominant mode of thought, or perhaps fortunately. What ended up sort of occurring was that the nationalist aspect of the Islamists, like Hassan al-Banna, and the secular aspect of the secularists became fused in a sort of Egyptian nationalism, which began to take stage here. Of course, the Egyptian nationalists themselves were not drawing inspiration from these two camps. They were drawing inspiration in many cases from foreign examples. Mustafa Kemal, for example, Mustafa Kemal, not to be confused with Mustafa Kemal, the future president of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal was deeply enamored with Japanese society, and in fact saw Japanese ethnic nationalism as being the guiding post for Egypt. And this view was called Pharaonism, that they would connect Egypt back with the stories of ancient Egypt, that Egypt would be considered to be one society with an incredibly long lineage and development. And in fact, today, to say that seems patently obvious, that Egypt is the descendants of the pharaohs. But that was not generally the perspective in the beginning of the 20th century. The general perspective is that Egyptian history prior to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, which we covered in episode 3, is not worth knowing. That the Islamic conquest brought civilization to Egypt. In many ways, this story echoes, in a certain way, the white man's burden, right? In this case, it's the Arab man's burden. They brought civilization to a rather uncivilized people, and therefore the backwardness of the historic Egyptians is not worth knowing. In fact, many Egyptians in this period believed that the pyramids were built by the Muslims, not by the ancient Egyptian civilization. So you had this rediscovery by leaders like Mustafa Kamil and later Saad Zaghlul, who you can see in the upper right-hand side, that there is an Egyptian identity, and the Egyptians form a nation regardless of religion, regardless of economic status, regardless of connection to the Ottoman Empire or not. These are individuals who are the inheritors of the pharaonic legacy. And you can see the cartoons here where, in both cases, we see the return to pharaonic Egypt juxtaposed with the British colonial or British imperialist position inside of Egypt. For example, you can see Tutankhamun here yelling in Arabic, because of course Tutankhamun spoke fluent Arabic, but it works for the newspaper editorial, shouting at Lord Carnarvon, the financier behind the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. And in it, he says, effectively, go back to your country and give me and let me speak to the rulers of this land, meaning the people of this land. And of course, he's referring to Saad Zaghlul in this sort of sense, an Egyptian representing Egyptians concerning the Egyptian future. And of course, you can see in the other cartoon that Saad Zaghlul is returning from Gibraltar to the Egyptian people, and this is going to cause a revitalization within Egypt. And this view of Pharaonism, of Egyptian nationalism, really comes to a head after World War I. During World War I, the irony of Egypt being under pseudo-British rule, while de jure, legally, being part of the Ottoman Empire, broke apart. Because the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire were at war during the First World War. So the British broke the Egyptians off from the Ottomans and made it a puppet state of their own. So now the British were in direct control of Egypt in the post-World War I environment. And while the Egyptians were willing to accept, to a certain degree, British direct control during World War I because of how chaotic that period was, once peace had come, the Egyptians could not see any value in a continuing direct British occupation. And Saad Zaghlul and many other wafdists, waft being the Arabic word for delegation, referring to the delegation that assembled to go in front of the British to petition for more Egyptian autonomy, if not outright independence. The wafdists organized this protest march in which a significant portion of Egypt's population, especially from the lower classes and among women, manifested their desire for an independent Egypt. And in fact, it was the recommendation of General Allenby, one of the World War I commanders who operated in this theater, that it be granted to them, because there was absolutely no way that without the Waft's support that the British could maintain any toehold in Egypt. And so maintaining a relationship with an independent or quasi-independent vassal state would be preferable to the British than forcible expulsion, which was likely to happen. And so Egypt was granted independence under the Khedive, that still descendant of Muhammad Ali, in 1922. And so you end up having this situation where the Khedive now declares Egypt to be the kingdom, and not just the kingdom of Egypt, but the kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. Remember back to Turkish Sudan and Egypt's expansion there. This was part of Egypt's honor being restored. The Sudan had been sectioned off from Egypt in 1885 as a result of the Mahdist Wars and as a result of the Veiled Protectorate. So what ended all of those discussed in episode 54 and episode 55. So by calling it the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, which was resisted quite strongly by the British, the Egyptians were making their claim to restore the historical legacy that had been taken from them, at least in their view. Now, in order to maintain Egypt as in some kind of vassal state, in order to maintain it as being loyal to the British, the Egyptians were required to sign the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of Alliance in 1936, and this treaty gave the British a number of key rights with respect to Egypt. The most important two are that the British would be responsible for securing communications and defending Egypt against all foreign aggression, meaning that Egypt's army was in the service of the British, and also that the British would be responsible for protecting foreigners and minorities, which means that in many ways, the foreigners and the minorities come to be identified with external forces. They come to be identified with foreign and imperialist designs on Egypt, as opposed to being seen as an indigenous Egyptian population. And increasingly, during this period, we begin to see a new sense of Egyptian identity that shifts away from the parochial nature of Egyptian nationalism and towards the Islamism of the Muslim Brotherhood, this sort of pan-identity. Now, Islamism itself, right, the idea that Islam should be the governing law of a modern nation state, doesn't necessarily become the dominant perspective, but it's certainly a perspective in play. And so this begins to erode at the identity of Egyptian nationalism that ties Egyptian identity to the historic territory of Egypt. And we see this in several different ways. The first one is that we see interaction between Egyptians and Muslims in other parts of the world. Probably the most famous case was that a number of Chinese Muslims, these are called Hui, and are a different group from the Uyghur, who are currently being oppressed. These are indigenous Chinese, Han, who have converted to Islam, and so they consist of their own minority called Hui. And Imam Da Pusheng of the Hui visited Egypt, and his story of the difficulties that China was going through. At that time, China was in the middle of a civil war between the communists and the nationalists themselves were in a civil war between different warlord factions. Imam Da was very much interested in having Egyptian military support or social support or economic support, like from any other Muslim country, to help him. And Egyptians, by and large, sympathized with the situation in China, that China had also been invaded by imperialist powers, and that the Muslims in China were not able to manifest their own desires for protection and freedom within the context of China. You also have this spreading on the Arab side. You had Arabs beginning to see a connection between themselves in a certain degree and Arabs in other countries. For example, during World War II, Egypt signed the Alexandria Protocol with several other Arab countries, which would form the basis for the post-war Arab League, indicating that there would be a concern outside of the Arab world, especially as Zionism was beginning to become more and more concrete in its creation of the State of Israel. And finally, you have increasing allegiance of many Egyptians to the Muslim Brotherhood, seeing that as a way to manifest their own political will when the political will of the royalty was so circumscribed by the British. And the war with Israel that ended up materializing in May of 1948 did not go well for Egypt. In fact, the Egyptians were on the back foot as early as late 1948 and 1949, with Israelis able to take positions in Eilat, the farthest south point of the British Mandate. And they even crossed the border into the Egyptian-controlled Sinai before their commanders decided that they would withdraw to the mandatory boundary, mandatory being the boundary of the Mandate. The Egyptians, in many cases, seriously refused to negotiate with the Zionists. So strong was their enmity for this new country. And Ralph Bunche hosted a negotiation with the two of them in the same room, and the Egyptians would only ever talk to him. It got so funny that by the time that an Israeli sneezed, an Egyptian said, "Bless you," it was the only conversation between an Egyptian and an Israeli directly. Regardless, Egypt was the first country to sign a ceasefire with the nation state of Israel in February of 1949. And the only area remaining under Egyptian control from the former mandate was Gaza, where many Palestinians had fled. Now, the failure of the Egyptian military here, combined with the failure of the Palestinian cause, shook all of these post-parochial Egyptians who were pan-Arab or pan-Muslim, who were motivated by these different concerns that I just raised earlier that had developed increasingly during the 1930s, saw this defeat in terms of those wider considerations as opposed to a direct consideration of Egypt. But for all Egyptians, regardless of whether they were Pharaonists or whether they were in those other camps, the fact that Egypt was defeated by an enemy widely perceived to be westernized, widely perceived to be made up of settler colonials, like had been seen across North Africa, was an issue from a fundamental perspective of a return to imperialism, of a reentrenchment of this foreign occupational force, at least from their perspective. And accordingly, the king was more and more seen as ineffective and incapable of making Egypt a truly independent country and represented of the Egyptian will. King Farouk himself was particularly ostentatious in terms of how he spent his money, and the public knew it. They also knew him to be a philanderer. He slept with multiple women. He was not pious in any way. And for an Egyptian population that was largely conservative, this behavior seemed both illegitimate from a moral perspective, but also illegitimate from a person perspective. He didn't represent what Egyptians were. He wasn't ethnically Egyptian, right? He comes from this Albanian family that spoke Turkish. He lived a life that most of them could never dream of, and that even if they could dream of it, they would find insulting. And so there was really no love lost over the years for King Farouk. Which brings us to the events of 1951 and the officers' coup of 1952. The military was increasingly agitated by its loss in the 1948 war. And combined with the increasing dissatisfaction of the population with King Farouk, they began to coordinate together in secret, calling themselves the Free Officers. Now, the majority of these free officers were relatively low in the Egyptian military command. Mohammed Naguib was one of the few who had the rank of general. But most of the highest levels of the military were still loyal to the king. And so there were needs to create increasingly pressure on the king and demonstrate that he couldn't achieve the nationalization and the forward actions that the Egyptians or looking for. So the target that ends up occurring is the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal was still under the direct control of the British military. Remember that under the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936, the British have permission to operate militarily within Egypt. They have control of that. And so the British had withdrawn primarily to the Canal Zone, but Egyptian soldiers began to fight them. And this led to large-scale skirmishes and crises throughout Egypt. You also have pressure from the British to stabilize the situation, talking about that they would launch a large-scale invasion unless the king could think of something else. And because of these increasing disturbances, the free officers began to believe that they had an opportunity to overthrow the monarchy and take power into their own hands, which they did in July of 1952. Now, before we start talking about the free officers and their reforms and what they were looking for and all of these kinds of things, it's very important for us to understand the kinds of convulsions that are going on in the Arab world at this point and how Egypt takes a center role in almost all of them. So one of the things that I've pointed out on several occasions, probably most in depth in episode 62 and 63, is that Arab socialism, which is the philosophy that ends up guiding especially Nasser, who is a member of this free officers movement, is a philosophy that is left-wing by the standards of the Middle East, but also has a number of right-wing attributes if we understand those in the context of modern political thought. So one particular example, right, where we would see them as left-wing are the first two bullet points on the left-hand side, that they support republics and secular power over religion, that they believe in revolution towards new systems, that they believe in some degree of wealth distribution, industry nationalization, and the like. But in many cases, things that we would consider right-wing are also a key part of Arab socialism. The idea of crushing protests, the idea of prioritizing a national ethnic group, and the idea of expansionist militant foreign policy as opposed to a more diplomatic one or a more reserved one. Now, we should understand this distinction between what would be left in the West and what would be left in the Middle East when we talk about the fundamental revolution that the free officers began in not just in Egypt, but in the wider Arab context, a revolution against the previous system. And the previous system were generally Western-aligned, autocratic, somewhat theocratic monarchies. Because if we remember from our discussion in episode 62, the medieval system in most Middle Eastern countries, which was preserved somehow through the colonial period because it was basically supported in many cases by the colonizers, especially if those colonizers were British, was that there would be a secular leader, but there would also be religious individuals who would form part of the government and be responsible for the adjudication of religious issues, things like marriage or things like inheritance, whereas the secular ruler would do more domestic things like contract and tort law, taxes, and similar. And most of these monarchies continue to be supportive of the West. They continue to have relations with the West. Egypt was a unique example in that the Egyptian government was fervently anti-Western, but forcibly shackled to the West through British treaties. But in many cases, these monarchs were very happily pro-British or pro-American. One particular example that I can think of is Oman, where in 1970, the Omanis actually asked the British to help. The Omani crown prince, Qaboos bin Said, actually asked the British to help him overthrow the government of his father. So you have this Western alignment between these quasi-theocratic, autocratic monarchies and something new, the Arab socialists, who were secular autocrats of their own, who at least made the case that they were going to create republics, that they were going to institute democracy of some sort. We should also understand a little bit about what this Pan-Arabism is, because there's this sort of idea that Pan-Arabism is just the natural outcome of the political situation in the Arab world, that you have a bunch of people who speak similar languages, and that in truth, they're just one people divided by borders. This is, however, an outgrowth of the Pan-Arab movement that Pharaonists like Saad Zaghlul and other local nationalists, for example, we've talked about the Syrian nationalism of Antoun Saadeh, we've talked about the Algerian liberalism of Amir Khalid, we've talked about a number of different individuals who had a very parochial sense of nationalism that it pertained to their specific region, their specific history and identity. And in contrast, Pan-Arabism was the idea that those local differences really didn't matter. Those were just shades of the same color. And so what needed to happen was an agglomeration of all these Arabs into one unified state. And you should make the call that in organizations and individuals who were opposed to this, who were trying to maintain an individual state, should be removed from governmental office. And we also have to talk about, within the context of Arab socialism, the ideas that they had about who an Arab was. In particular, I want to talk about Saad al-Khusri, and we talked about this in depth in episode 62, but it's worth touching on it here. Saad al-Khusri was an individual who really set the tone within Arab socialism for what an Arab was. And his argument is that Arabs are any people who speak Arabic as their dominant language. The end. Now, there are many people who might not with that assertion. For example, and we're going to see the Copts as one example, Jews as well. There are a number of minorities throughout Arab majority countries that speak Arabic because that is the dominant language of the country, but they wouldn't see themselves as Arabic. And some of them, as I pointed out, are non-Muslims, like the Copts, like the Jews, like the Greeks. And some of them are Muslims. These are Turks, Kurds, Persians, and other and blacks. So you have these kinds of situations. But in the view of Saad al-Khusri, if a person did not recognize their own Arabness, he should be educated to the point where he does recognize it. And any means of education were acceptable to him. That should give you an idea of how this national identity would be accepted by some, but refused by others and subject to a coercive attempt to make them believe. Now, there's another piece that's worth highlighting here, and it's something that Mohammed Naguib actually speaks about, Mohammed Naguib being the first president of Egypt after the Free Officers coup in 1952. And it's that Egypt, since the fall of the pharaohs, had not been ruled by an indigenous Egyptian until the Free Officers coup. And I've put together this table where you can see all the different governments that operated in the territory of Egypt and whether or not those governments had their capital city in Egypt, meaning that the empire was based in Egypt or based somewhere else, and what the ethnic character was of those who ruled. And in each case, even if those countries are based in Egypt, the rulers aren't Egyptian. Now, of course, as I mentioned, Mohammed Naguib pointed out when Westerners made a lot of discussion about this in 1953, that many of those who had ruled Egypt, especially those who ruled from Egypt, like the Alawiya dynasty, like the Tulunids or the Rashiduns, that these individuals became captured by Egypt, that they became Egyptified, if you could say that. And so their will, their goals matched those of the Egyptian people. That Saladin, for example, of the Ayyubid dynasty, was somebody who genuinely believed in the future of Egypt, and that he didn't have to be genetically Egyptian to feel that way. But this draws out something that is often not really discussed when it comes to Middle Eastern history, which is that oftentimes when people speak about Israel, they talk about a country that hasn't existed since the ancient period and suddenly shows up on the map today, ruled by Jews, and that throughout the last 2,000 years, that Jews had not governed themselves in the Middle East. But Israel's actually not unique in this. Egypt, Iraq, Syria generally, a number of these different countries that exist today hadn't actually ruled themselves for millennia either. They were ruled by different empires and different people. And the 20th century was one of the greatest moments of emancipation for almost all the peoples of the Middle East from the various empires under which they sat. Now, of course, it's worth pointing out that a number of the governors in these Middle Eastern countries during the Ottoman period, during some of the earlier periods, had significant degrees of autonomy. Granted, in Egypt, as I pointed out, that autonomy was so great that they were able to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. But that still is not a manifestation of the indigenous population's will to self-govern. And that's something that a lot of Middle Eastern countries are still struggling to understand how to deal with, because the will of the indigenous people and their governments are often at loggerheads even today. So getting back to 1952, you have Mohammed Naguib, who is a celebrated Air Force colonel who fought in the war against Israel in 1948. And he becomes the leader of what's called the Revolutionary Command Council. This is a council of roughly 14 officers who had been the free officers, and they all sort of governed together. It's worth pointing out that the free officers generally shared certain political views and opinions, but they understood that their rule couldn't be legitimate unless they got support from other branches of the Egyptian political world. And so before they launched the coup in July of 1952, they got support from two unlikely allies, one being the Muslim Brotherhood, which was absolutely revolted by the fact that Egypt had lost the war in Israel. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, as we'll talk about later, sent soldiers to fight under its own banner during that struggle. And from the communists, the Democratic Movement for the National Liberation, also known by its Arabic acronym Haditu, was the only communist party in Egypt that threw its weight behind the Revolutionary Command Council. But they did so under the understanding that this was going to be an Arab socialist revolution. And so a number of communist or quasi-communist ideals would likely be achieved. Now, of course, both of these groups later regret their decision, since the Revolutionary Command Council neither supports Islamism nor overt communism, with many of the free officers being huge supporters of capitalism, or if they support socialism, light socialism. And so they begin to coordinate their efforts to transform the country. And we're going to talk about some of those transformations in a second. But at first, Mohammed Naguib differed with the members of the Revolutionary Command Council about the direction of this new coup. In his view, the primary goal of the revolution was not to unseat the government, but to redirect it. And so it wasn't to remove the monarchy. The military shouldn't be governing. The military should be a caretaker to institute the return of a good government. The idea that a military coup will result in a new king reestablishing the traditional way that Egypt has been governed and allowing that way to develop in a way that Egypt would approve of. And so he forced Farouk to live in exile in Italy, but his infant son, Fuad II, who you can see there, days after he left the throne, I'm talking about the baby, would be the official king of Egypt. And he would rule in his own name. At the same time, 3 members of the free officers, including the more famous Anwar Sadat, the future 3rd president of Egypt, or 4th president, depending on how you count it, and Baghdadi, formed the Revolutionary Tribunal that would seek to determine the guilt or innocence of various crimes of individuals from the former king's government. One of the things, however, that's worth pointing out is that the Arab socialists did not want to reach out to any of the established political parties. They didn't want to reach out to the Wafd. They didn't want to reach out to any group of Egyptians who would have their own political will that could be different from the free officers and be able to express that will meaningfully. In fact, the Wafd party by this time had been associated in many respects with the monarchy in its most ostentatious and problematic aspects, especially kowtowing to imperialism. And so the Wafd party was forcibly excluded from the possibility of having a future stake in the role of future stake in Egypt's development. So you begin seeing antipathy develop between Nasser and Mohammed Naguib. And we see that antipathy developing because Nasser's view is that effectively a republic should be formed, the monarchy should be abolished. And in fact, he moves towards this by ending the monarchy in 1953. Fuad II is sent into exile. And he begins to consolidate power in his own name. How does he do this? First of all, within the 14 members of the Free Officers Movement of the Revolutionary Command Council, he manages to get more and more allies to his side as opposed to that of Mohammed Naguib. The next one is that he consolidates power directly. One particularly horrendous example was in Kafr Dawar, which is an Egyptian city. There were a large number of riots from groups that wanted to unionize. In the view of Gamal Abdel Nasser, there should be no private unions within the country of Egypt. And so he repressed the riots that occurred in the summer, and he executed 2 of the leaders of the riot. This was the nail in the coffin of Haditu's relationship with the Revolutionary Command Council, because they couldn't sanction the possible disruption of labor unions and their goals for economic and political survival. He also consolidated his rule by amplifying the number of people who would be loyal to the revolution. And he did this through what's called the Agrarian Reform Law that was passed on 11th of September 1952. This law would force a maximum of landholdings to about 200 fidans. It's about 10 fidans to an acre. It's about 10 fidans to an acre. So it meant that nobody could own more than 20 acres of land in Egypt. Now, for most Egyptians, that's not a problem, but for the wealthiest few, it resulted in their lands being expropriated and redivided for the peasants. This was a massive social redistribution of wealth, resulting in significant numbers of poor Egyptians moving into the lower middle class Egyptians moving into the middle class, and creating increasingly a bed of economic support for Nasser and a bed of popular support for Nasser, given how their lives were improving under his rule. The next key piece that Nasser did was to try and negotiate with the British concerning Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. This was at Mohammed Naguib's direction. Then Nasser met with both British and Sudanese authorities regarding the possible independence of Sudan. Now, as we remember during the kingdom period, the kings had named the country Egypt and Sudan, such that Sudan should be part of Egypt. And this posed a great problem for the possibility of Sudanese independence. because the Sudanese did not want to live necessarily under Egyptian control. But Muhammad Naguib saw the possibility that pro-Egyptian parties would arise in Sudan, especially those led by Ismail al-Azhari, who became the first president of an independent Sudan in 1954. But because of this, he was willing to accede to Sudanese independence, and Nasser managed to negotiate with the British, represented by their foreign minister Eden, about the independence of Sudan and its separation from Egypt as an independent polity. Now, one of the ironies of al-Azhari is that as soon as he comes to power, he realizes that there's too much pressure in Sudan from the Sudanese population against unification with Egypt, against a policy that would submit in a certain way Sudan to Egypt because of the historic relationship that those two countries had had. And accordingly, once in power, he did almost everything possible to avoid unification. And it's one of the reasons why Sudan remains independent today. But Nasser was able to fully concretize his power when he had Muhammad Naguib arrested and removed from power. Muhammad Naguib lived the rest of his life in house arrest in Egypt, as Nasser was able to consolidate his power, and because Nasser had gained and created alliances with most of the members of the Free Officers movement, he was able to do so without incident. The only other major opposition to the power of the Free Officers group came in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, which increasingly saw Nasser and his attempt to grab onto power as being a threat to their Islamist style of governing. Nasser was committed to the principle of secularism and opposed to the idea that Islam should have a place in government. There's actually a very famous video. It's from later, but it sort of espouses Nasser's position on it, where he's asked about women wearing the veil, and he simply laughs it out of the room, in that it would be so ridiculous to force Egyptian women to veil. So they tried to assassinate him on the 26th of October, 1954. And this resulted in a series of government-directed riots against the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, their headquarters was burned in early November of 1954, and many members of the Brotherhood had to flee to foreign countries. Now, the Brotherhood managed to regroup when it was in those foreign countries. In particular, we have Saeed Ramadan, who is the son-in-law of Hassan al-Banna, and he lived in Germany primarily, coordinating Muslim Brotherhood operatives and cells from Munich. The fact that Muslim Brotherhood leaders left, though, didn't mean that the Muslim Brotherhood was vanquished, not in the slightest. Muslim Brotherhood became part and parcel of Egypt as it had been since the 1930s, and simply retreated into the mosques and other areas where it would be harder for the Egyptian government to monitor it. This resulted in an Egyptian counter to this. First, a number of leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal and executed in order to prevent them from being able to disseminate their ideas. And further to this, the State Security Investigation Service, which had already existed since the 19-teens, was amplified in terms of its scope and ability, becoming a secret police that operated throughout Egyptian society and monitored for any collusion with anti-government forces, which could be communists on the one hand, or more commonly, Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. And it's worth sort of walking through what the Islamists really saw as the problem, the fundamental problem with the secular approach. In their view, they thought that secularism was imported, that it was a European creation, that it had no correspondence to the needs and realities of Islam, and therefore couldn't provide key solutions to people's livelihoods. Secular governments were not going to respond necessarily to the people's needs in a way that could facilitate their growth, development, and spiritual well-being. And so the Muslim Brotherhood began to pioneer the slogan, Islam huwa al-hal, or Islam is the solution, meaning that in implementation of Islamic law as the national law of government would be one that would result in the creation of a set of reforms that would improve the country. And in fact, if we look at the rest of that campaign poster, it says, Al-Islam huwa al-hal, Islam is the solution, ma'an lil-islah, together for the reforms, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, Nahmil al-Khair li-kull al-nas, we will bring the good for all people. So you can see that the fundamental drive for the Muslim Brotherhood, at least in the campaign space, was actually a reference not to necessarily the moral claims that they would make privately, but to a direct repartee with the claims of Arab socialism, that the Arab socialists, like Nasser, were going to improve people's lives in monetary and material terms. It's also worth noting that the Muslim Brotherhood were not afraid of a fight, and periodically in Egypt, they would try to start up rebellions. It shouldn't be surprising because the Muslim Brotherhood had already fought against the Israelis in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 by sending their own units. And they didn't see any problem turning those against an Egyptian authority that they felt was trespassing on the need for Islamic governance. So now that Nasser is able to consolidate power, he begins to increase the attention that's being paid to Arab socialists like himself through the creation of radio networks. Radio was incredibly common in the Arab world. And so in order to get his message out, he used Sawt al-Arab, or the voice of the Arabs, to communicate. Nasser had a particular style in terms of how he communicated that made his Arabic understandable not only to Egyptians, but beyond Egypt, and allowed Nasser to become the face and power behind the Pan-Arab movement more generally. In his view, and we're going to see this throughout Nasser's reign until 1970 when he dies, he saw himself as being part of that revolution that I talked about, where Arab socialists were going to replace Western-aligned monarchies. And because of this, he would reach out to any political individual, any government that seemed to be part of that revolution. For example, you can see Nasser there walking with Ahmed bin Bella from Algeria, the first Algerian president, and with I think Salman Arif, who was the prime minister of Iraq at that point, the president of Iraq. Both of these individuals were running Arab socialist republics. And so they saw a commonality with Nasser, and Nasser saw a commonality with them. They were the vanguard of his revolution. Because of the radio and because of Nasser's presence in other countries facilitating their growth in terms of Arab nationalism, he became incredibly popular. And the people saw him as a representative of their will in many respects. In many respects. In fact, you can see this is a picture that was taken after he had convinced the British finally to withdraw from the Suez Canal zone. And he had just had that assassination attempt against him by the Muslim Brotherhood. His negotiations with the British to remove them from the Suez Canal, and what eventually led to his nationalization of the canal, again, this was seen as a restoration of the honor that Egypt had already had. As we mentioned, Khedive Ismail was the person who had basically been forced to sell the canal to the British and the French. This was a humiliation of Egyptian power and prestige, and now the Egyptians had forced the British out. The Egyptians were taking control of their own canal and were going to assert their own power. Of course, Egypt also saw itself as part of the wider political system that was developing at the time. Nasser joined Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Boris Tito of Yugoslavia to form the non-aligned movement. In his view, at least at the beginning of his leadership, Egypt shouldn't have to choose between the West and the Soviets. He should be able to use whichever advantage he had in terms of building his country, and accordingly, being able to be friendly with both sides could serve a key advantage. Increasingly, though, and we're going to talk about why, Nasser began to become more and more part of the Soviet sphere. And as he became more and more involved with the Soviet sphere, he became involved with socialism internationally, moreover. So you can see, for example, in one of the last attested moments for Che Guevara came to Egypt and received from Nasser a number of awards for his actions in the Cold War, promoting communism. We should also look a little bit about cultural developments under Nasser. Nasser presided over one of the largest industrial and social growths of Egypt, but not only that, he presided over immense cultural growth in Egypt. Kulthum, who we've discussed before, is probably the best musical voice from the period. She absolutely adored Nasser, and Nasser adored her. She wrote a number of key songs designed to support the Egyptian state, claiming that it was their country, supporting his reforms, and generally speaking, supporting the idea of Arab nationalism as Gamal Abdel Nasser was putting it forward. Naguib Mahfouz also lived during this period and is one of Egypt's foremost writers, one of the few Middle Easterners to receive a Nobel Prize that's not Israeli. And Mahfouz and his literature discussed the ideas of Arab nationalism in the wider scale of personal development and growth of his characters. We have Hoda Sha'rawi, who, although she comes a little bit before this time, her views become part and parcel of the Arab socialist message, namely that women should be an equal part of Egyptian society. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, most women in Egypt are unveiled and are able to join the workforce for the first time. Of course, that doesn't mean that acts of misogyny didn't occur during this period. Certainly they did, and a number of professions were at least functionally closed to women, even if not legally so. That said, part of the secularist mantra that Nasser was promoted the genuine equality of men and women to a certain degree. The same cannot be said for the ethnic and religious minorities of Egypt. Now, the Copts are by far the largest Egyptian minority. Depending on whose count you use, we're talking about 10 to 15% of the Egyptian population. And for the first time in Egyptian history, the Copts are othered in a very serious sense during the Arab nationalist period. During the Pharaonist period and during previous periods, Coptic identity had never really been called out affirmatively. Copts simply were Christians. And during the time of the Mamluk Sultanate or the Ottoman Empire, they were subject to a number of specific religious taxes. And Those sort of subsided by the middle of the 19th century. But that said, they were identified primarily through their religious orientation and outside of a nationalist context. So they were part of Egypt, but they were not a unique part of Egypt. They just were Egyptians who happened to be Christian. The fundamental change that occurred with Arab nationalism is that Nasser was now identifying the Egyptian people as Arab, and he was using Saad al-Husri's definition of who is an Arab. And under that definition, the Copts are Arabs. They are an Arabic-speaking people who live in what is traditionally an Arab-speaking land. But Copts, by and large, did not agree with this characterization. Magdi Khalil is probably the most famous currently living Copt who espouses this philosophy called Coptic nationalism, but it was extant during this period, and Copts who promoted it were subject to attack by the state security services. So many of them have fled abroad. Magdi Khalil, in particular, for example, lives in London. But the Copts generally saw themselves as the Egyptian ethnicity, that their concerns, that their interests, that their direction should be for Egypt and Egypt alone, that the Arab nationalist and Arab socialist perspective, because of its pan-Arab nature, because of its non-parochialism, was going to disadvantage Egypt for the benefit of the other Arabs. And in fact, many of the Copts talked about the war with Israel specifically in these terms, that Egypt was giving up its wealth and its people and its lives to attack a foreign state that is repressing a foreign group of people. Now, would the war still be moral? Most Copts said yes, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily in the best interest of Egypt to pursue it. Understandably, as Nasser was making his argument that Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism were the key directions of the future, that there should be a united polity, of course Israel couldn't be there. Of course, Israel being there was a threat to the Arab nation. And much of his speeches centered on the destruction of the state of Israel, specifically because of this. So the Coptic perspective was one that he could not tolerate. And one of the things, again, that we'll see throughout Nasser's regime and the regime of his successors is that dissenting views are severely punished. The other minorities in Egypt make up less than 2% apiece. We're talking about Jews like Yusuf Katawi. We're talking about Egyptian Greeks who primarily live in Alexandria and are heavily involved in shipping. You have Egyptian Turks. You have Egyptian Amazigh. All of these populations, generally speaking, faced incredible difficulties during the Nasserist period, because even though Pan-Arabism never made it explicit, and in fact encouraged Christians and Jews within their territories to identify as Arabs, there was a strong undercurrent that these people were somehow different, especially if they were not indigenous, like the Greeks, for example, who had come centuries ago, but were still clearly not Egyptian. This was not helped, of course, by the fact that Nasser was also heavily opposed to the wealthy landowning or business classes, of which Greeks and Jews were disproportionately represented. In fact, analysis of ledgers from the 1860s to the 1940s show that despite being a combined 5% of the population, Jews and Greek Egyptians were owners of about 40% of all businesses in the country. Jews, of course, is unsurprisingly, they were primarily involved in financial institutions, and Greeks, similarly, unsurprisingly, were primarily involved in shipping. But these two groups, because of their non-Arabness, their difference, and their economic weight, were individuals that were now subject to increasing recriminations. The Jews also had the unfortunate political situation of being seen by Nasser's government and by many of his supporters as being proxies for the state of Israel. And so after the 1956 Suez Crisis, which we're going to get to in a bit, Jews were subject to rampant persecution. Over 1,000 of them were imprisoned. Most of the rest of them fled, eventually arriving in Israel itself. So we also have to talk about where Egypt sat in the larger Cold War. And I mentioned that Egypt started the Cold War as part of the non-aligned group. And that would survive until Egypt began to need the Soviet Union more and more. And it needed it for different reasons. The first one is that there's a comment here that the Lavon affair was also responsible for persecution against the Jews after the Suez Crisis of 1956. That's absolutely correct. And the Lavon affair, for those who may be unfamiliar, was an attempt by the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, to convince Egyptian Karaite Jews to commit a small act of terrorism. It was discovered. The individuals responsible were prosecuted. But of course, the conspiratorial thinking would go that maybe more Jews were loyal to the state of Israel secretly or in open, and Egypt had to do something about it to protect its people. So if we go back to the Cold War alliances, Egypt was in a position where it was the leader, at least nominally, of the Arab world because of Nasser's abilities. But we also have to remember that he was the leader of a changing Arab world. He was the leader of the revolution. And so the Cold War necessarily put enemies of his revolution together. A perfect example was the creation of the Baghdad Pact, where Iraq was a country ruled by a pro-Western monarchy, and which joined this alliance under British protection, both because of threats from the Soviets and from threats from pan-Arabists, like Nasser, who could theoretically overturn the regime. You also had increasing fears from countries on the Arabian Peninsula, and we're going to discuss that in a bit, about what Nasser is and what he could represent to their monarchies. Because of this alliance that increasingly shifted towards aligning with the West, Nasser was necessarily pushed into a position that would be more pro-Soviet than he had originally anticipated. And this was accelerated by the West's increasing intransigence when it came to funding his domestic growth projects. You can see Khrushchev and Nasser standing together after Khrushchev had agreed to finance, at least in large part, the Aswan High Dam, which was Nasser's biggest production. And here we go. So just to put into perspective what the Aswan High Dam was and why it was so important, the Nile River is, of course, the lifeblood of Egypt. But there were several fundamental issues with using it. The first one was that it flooded annually. And while it was more predictable in its floods than a number of other rivers, which flood temperamentally, it meant that significant areas of otherwise fertile land could not be cultivated. Because those areas, if you built a farm on them, the farm will just wash away every spring. So it's not really a great investment. The next key element is that Egypt was a net power importer, and this would help to, with the creation of hydroelectric facilities, be able to create power for Egypt and spread that throughout the country, especially Upper Egypt, the southern part of the country, which was generally disconnected from Cairo, from Alexandria, from the other power centers that would have a lot more access to electricity. And so over the course of the 1960s, the Aswan High Dam kicks into gear with first an excavation of the Nile diversion pass-through, which was used so that way while they were building the dam that the water would go around that area. and completing in 1970 with the opening of the dam. Now, one of the interesting things to sort of take into account here is that with the creation of the dam, you would have the creation of a small lake that sits behind the dam as all that water collects, and low-lying areas would be flooded, which resulted in UNESCO's interest in the temple at Abu Simbel. Now, the temple at Abu Simbel, as you can see from the picture with the two circles on it, was literally carved into the rock of the mountain. But that was all area that would come to be under Lake Nasser, this lake that would sit behind the Aswan High Dam. Now, in order to preserve Abu Simbel, UNESCO coordinated with the Egyptian government to cut Abu Simbel into a number of blocks and pieces, and that these would be reassembled at a higher altitude. But not only were these blocks reassembled, an entire new mountain had to be created in order to build the temple into this new mountain. It was a massive undertaking, which has been intensely successful, because as you can see from the image, if they hadn't done that, the entire temple would have been flooded. Because of the Soviet contributions to the Aswan High Dam, there is in fact very close to it a monument commemorating the Arab-Soviet friendship, how the Soviets have intervened in the strength and long-term prosperity of the Egyptian people. It's worth pointing out that after the dam came online and began providing significant amounts of electricity to the country, it also provided a significant amount of farmland, especially in the Nile Delta. So the amount of land actually that Egypt came to be able to cultivate after the Aswan High Dam's construction increased by about 30%, which is quite significant, and further feeds into the agricultural programs that Nasser had been outlining during the earlier part of his rule, and allowed more and more individuals to own their own land and achieve within the Egyptian system. Nasser was also responsible for the creation of large-scale educational institutions, medical institutions, and other developments that increased the social welfare of the population, in many cases supported or helped by the Soviet Union. In terms of the external political perspective of Nasser, he was very much in favor of continuing Fedayeen raids into the State of Israel. As we mentioned in the Palestine presentations that were last week and the week before, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, and from 1959 until 1967, Egypt used the Gaza Strip as a staging area for their own Fedayeen attacks against the Israelis. That said, more numerous were the attacks from the Jordanian side, but Egypt continued to facilitate these attacks as a way of demonstrating their loyalty to the Arabist cause. So if we look at 1956 from Nasser's perspective, Nasser had just nationalized the Suez Canal, and he just nationalized it to use the revenue generated from the Suez Canal to help pay off the loans that the Soviets had given him for building the Aswan High Dam. From his perspective, in addition to the monetary sense that this made, this also made sense from that ideological perspective, that nationalizing the Suez Canal was recouping to Egypt something that had already been Egypt's. We could also see that the pressure from Egypt in going against the will of the British and the French served to bolster his anti-imperialist credentials. And this is why, for example, Iraq sent soldiers to the Jordanian-controlled West Bank. The idea was to say that even the British, who had tremendous control over Iraqi politics through Prime Minister Nouri al-Said, who would be Iraqi Prime Minister until 1958 when he was overthrown, that even he would not support the British control of the Suez Canal. He would allow the Egyptians to take back their territory. So from the Egyptian perspective, the reaction from the imperialists was not surprising. And in fact, it put Nasser now in a new stage of confrontation with them, and a stage of confrontation with them that would allow him to demonstrate, perhaps, that the Arabs had come a further way than was previously believed. The British and the French, however, wanted to put a stop to this set of politics from Nasser and reclaim the canal. From their perspective, without direct European control of the canal, it wasn't clear that A, they would be paid back on their investment, and B, that their ships would necessarily be allowed to go through, that the law of the seas would be followed. Now, the Americans pressured the British and the French not to take advantage of this period, of this. And Israel, however, decided to invade directly. And Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula and took the east bank of the Suez Canal. And they would have held it too, but for the fact that Eisenhower, the US president, began to press Israel to withdraw, arguing that US recognition of a number of benefits that had been conferred upon the Israelis would cease if they continued the occupation. Now, the Israelis felt it necessary to appease the Americans in this instance, and so they withdrew. And peacekeepers called the UN Expeditionary Force were placed along the Israeli border on the Egyptian side of the border in order to prevent further violence from occurring. You can see those UNEF peacekeepers. They had to be from countries that recognized both Israel and the Arab countries. So naturally, non-aligned countries like Yugoslavia were really great choices. From a British and French perspective, this was really the end of them being imperial states, being able to dictate terms to other countries that had before nominal and now real independence. But from Nasser's perspective, this was an incredible victory. He had stared down the Israeli military, and through diplomatic power, not his own, but he could pretend, he was able to push the Israelis back out of the Sinai and reclaim it for Egypt. In effect, his nationalization was successful and was effectively recognized by the United States and the rest of the world because of the way that Eisenhower had forced the Israelis, the British, and the French to abandon their positions. Riding high on this victory in the Suez Crisis, Nasser begins to look more abroad in order to expand the Pan-Arab project. And he reaches out to the president of Syria, Shukri al-Quwatli, over the possibility of creating a united Arab republic that would be able to hem Israel in on both sides and bring Syria into the Arab nationalist fold. There were two major problems with this. Egypt had very little in the sense of a concretized landholding aristocracy, especially after Nasser had engaged in his agrarian reform law in 1952, and a number of the other actions that had repressed or consumed money from large-scale landholders. Additionally, as most of the other political parties had been eliminated, labor unions were not permitted, and the military was more or less subservient to the RCC, right? That the Revolutionary Command Committee. Nasser didn't really have any accountability within Egypt. Syria was structured very differently from this. Syria was made of a number of different ethnic groups. It was not in any way homogenous like most of Egypt was. It had some minorities, but basically Egypt was over 80% Egyptian. Syria was a mix of Sunnis of different tribes, many of whom didn't see eye to eye, Shiites, Alawites, Druze, Christians, like the Assyrian minority, and so on. And so these populations had all had their own different landholding histories. They had their own different economic organization, and many of them had direct power in the various governments that had plagued Syria throughout the 1950s. And by plagued, I mean in the sense of how often they had coups and replaced each other. In 1949 alone, Syria had 3 different coups. So these groups were used to wielding a certain degree of power in the various different administrations. And even those Syrians who would be in favor of Arab nationalism, like the Ba'ath Party, which had been founded by Michel Aflaq, even these groups were excluded from Nasser's government. And in fact, he did everything in his power to purge the Syrian political establishment. There's a joke that's said about Syria in this regard, which is that in making Syria Egyptian, Syrians discovered that they weren't Egyptian, because all the structures that Egypt brought into Syria to make Syria into Egypt alienated significant sections of the Syrian population, especially those who were more educated. There were notable exceptions. For example, Abdel Hamid al-Siraj was an Alawite from Latakia who Nasser trusted and made his vice president in this new United Arab Republic. He would also have control over Syria while Nasser would stay in Egypt. But by and large, the Syrian political class rejected the United Arab Republic as soon as it had been formed. And in 1961, several officers from the army, led by Haidar al-Kozbari, a Turkish Syrian, took the territory in Damascus and grabbed the most important device in the room, the radio. Because remember, the radio was the seat of power. Sawt al-Arab was the Arab radio station of the Nasserists that had promulgated his message throughout the Arab world. And in the same tone, control of the radio meant control of the country. And the coup leaders, along with Kozbari, in September of 1961, basically ended the United Arab Republic in the Syrian territory and argued that no longer would there be a union with Egypt, that Syria would be its own government. And we're going to talk on the Syrian side a lot more about what this Egyptian occupation meant and how it affected the Syrians in the long term. But we have to understand this is a massive setback to Nasser's attempt to unify the Arab world. The first unification of two countries was a unification that effectively failed. But Nasserism wasn't only popular in Syria. Nasserism had an incredible amount of power throughout the Arab world. And so in Lebanon, for example, there was a Nasserist upsurge in 1958 as Camille Chamoun tried to hold on to power. Now, Camille decided to invoke the Eisenhower Doctrine, and we'll discuss this a lot more when we talk about Lebanon, to prevent the Nasserists from replacing him. And in fact, the Americans decided to intervene, and they put down those Nasserists and prevented them from being able to establish a republic in Lebanon. But you can sort of see the trend here, that Egypt is going effectively to these different countries through the soft power of propaganda and promoting the revolution against these traditional Western-aligned leaders. In the case of Syria and Lebanon, these are democratically elected, but they are still Western-aligned and, to a very strong degree, not interested in the Arab socialist or pan-Arab project. They're interested in a nationally oriented project. But Nasser is sort of seeing himself at the forefront of these revolutions and is effectively guiding them from Cairo. In the case of Syria, it was overturned in 3 years. In the case of Lebanon, it was overturned in around a month. But Nasserism would not only affect those countries. The fear of a Nasserist insurrection shouldn't be understated. The kings of Iraq and Jordan in 1958 decided, as a direct result of seeing the Egyptians and Syrians coming together in January, decided in February to try to create their own union. effectively trying to create this monarchic union. And originally, they sought help from the British, but the British refused to support this for one very strange reason, which is that the Iraqis wanted to include Kuwait into this union of monarchs. And you can see Abdullah III as-Salim, who was invited by King Faisal II to join this union. And the British objected because Kuwait at that time was still a British protectorate. It wouldn't stop being a British protectorate until the 1960s. And the British didn't want to give up control of Kuwait as a protectorate, and so they vetoed this entire process. Of course, the direct result of the Hashemite Union failing is that the Iraqi government would be subject to its own revolution, led by a number of Arab socialists, although not guided by one. And so we're going to see how that shakes out. But this undermines the Hashemite Union. And on the 14th of July, that revolution brings Iraq closer to being in the Nasserist sphere than it had ever been before. Given how many countries were becoming Nasserist around Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, the Jordanian monarchy was increasingly fearful of such a rebellion occurring. And in many respects, the 1970 Black September that we talked about in the Palestinian situation is directly connected to this fear, because in many ways, Yasser Arafat was an Arab socialist. In a certain way, he could be seen by the Jordanian authorities as a Nasserist. One of the last points that I wanted to make in regards to this is that the Jordanians actually expelled British troops from Jordan in 1956, specifically because Nasserism made Jordan look increasingly like a Western stooge. It was British generals like Lieutenant General Glubb, Lieutenant General Glubb, who were running the Arab Legion in Jordan and keeping it remarkably well trained. But that said, those leaders were in direct control of the Jordanian armed forces, which, especially to those in Egypt, looked suspiciously like what the British had been doing with the Suez Canal all those years during the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, namely that they were controlling Jordan through the effective maintenance of its military. And so the British were kicked out of Jordan by King Hussein in 1956, hoping to save the alliance by slaughtering this particular cow. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, Iraq had its own revolution, its own free officers, directly inspired by the Egyptian free officers. But they were led by a man named Abdul Karim Qasim. And Abdul Karim Qasim, uniquely, as opposed to most of the rest of the free officers, was not an Arab nationalist. He was an Iraqi nationalist. In much the same way that the Pharaonists proposed an Egypt-centered ideology, Abdul Karim Qasim proposed a Mesopotamia-centered ideology. And in fact, if you look at the flag of Iraq while he was in power, the symbol he used to represent Iraq was the sun, referring back to the sun god Shamash, which was a central god in both Babylonian and ancient Assyrian religious iconography. He was the light bringer, the civilization bringer to the people of Mesopotamia. Because Abdul Karim Qasim had this this Iraqi nationalist orientation, as opposed to an Arab nationalist orientation, Nasser wanted to create a new revolution to overthrow Abdul Karim Qasim. And this occurred in 1959 in the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. Nasser supported a number of Arab socialists, including ones that were already connected to the free officers, to stage a rebellion in the city. But due to his Iraqi nationalist orientation, Abdul Karim Qasim had no issue negotiating with the Kurds, led by Mustafa Barzani. And between the Kurdish forces coming from the northeast and the Arab forces coming from Baghdad, he was able to quash the Mosul uprising. And this permanently isolated Iraq from the new revolution that Nasser was spreading until Abdul Karim Qasim himself was overthrown in 1963 by a coup, which put the Arif brothers in power. There are debates as to whether the United States CIA was involved in the 1963 coup, because Abdul Karim Qasim, despite being an Iraqi nationalist, was also a socialist, not an Arab socialist, but a socialist. And he created numerous socialist style reforms, such as creation of middle-income cities like Madinat al-Thawra, which you can see in the upper left-hand picture. He also nationalized part of the Iraqi oil company. I'm sorry, the Iraqi Petroleum Company, which, despite its name, was owned entirely by non-Iraqis. He expropriated land from the wealthy and gave it to a number of poor, very similar to what Nasser was doing. He just did it in the name of Iraq rather than in the name of a wider pan-Arab sentiment. And another major thorn in the Egyptian situation was the Saudis. Now, we've been alluding to this in a certain way, but I'm going to now say it explicitly, which is that what was going on during this was a new Arab Cold War, where the Arabs were themselves engaged in this sort of battle between alignment with the West and alignment with the East. And by East, I mean the Soviet Union. And so the Western aligned monarchs in this map are in green at this point in the 1960s. And the Arab socialist countries are sort of tan in this map. Now, Saudi Arabia, as a West-aligned monarch, was one of the direct competitors with Egypt. And so you begin to see the Saudis trying to limit Egyptian influence, especially as we get later and later in the timeline. In the early period, the Saudis didn't know what to make of Nasser, and tried to have some form of relationship. In fact, the relationship was what was critical in persuading Jordan not to join the British-led Baghdad Pact, which would have made perfect sense for Jordan to join, given its alliance with the British. But as we get towards the later 1950s, we begin to see organizations like Al-Murabitun, which was a Nasserist political party in Saudi Arabia, and even a coup d'etat occurs in Saudi Arabia, supported by the Egyptians, intending to overthrow the Saudi monarchy. Of course, this coup fails, which is why the Saudi monarchy is still in power. But the Saudis return the favor in kind, offering Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, that vice president of the United Arab Republic, the one who was ruling Syria, £1.9 million to assassinate Nasser. He declined in 1959. And so you begin this sort of proxy war between the Saudis and the Egyptians throughout the Arab world over the question of how is the Arab world going to sit? Is it going to be Western-aligned monarchies, or is it going to be these new Arab socialist republics? The Saudis begin to do this outreach through the creation of scholarships and other wealth funds, primarily supported monetarily through the oil that they were exporting. And relations between the Egyptians and the Saudis didn't really improve until the 1980s. Probably the most devastating foreign policy decision that Nasser took was to foment the revolution in North Yemen. Now, if we remember from this time period, Yemen is divided into two. South Yemen is a number of British principalities, British-controlled principalities, and the north is under the leadership of a monarchy led by Mohammed al-Badr. Now, the Saudis supported the Yemeni royal family as part of this larger Cold War with the Egyptians. And like any Cold War, it has hot zones, and Yemen happens to be one of those hot zones. Nasser supported Salal, who wanted to found an Arab republic in North Yemen, and the fighting occurred from 1962 until 1970. We're going to talk about the Yemeni civil war when we get to Yemen in general, but there are a few points worth making with regards to how it affected Egypt. This was a draining war for Egypt. It can be seen in much the same way that the Americans see Vietnam. And at the height, 50,000 Egyptian soldiers, 500,000 Egyptian soldiers. The number, I'm pretty sure. Okay. Roughly a quarter of the Egyptian military was involved in Yemen. And that meant that because this war was from 1962 until 1970, those were soldiers that Egypt couldn't have to defend its own territory, which came under Israeli preemptive attack in 1967. The next thing is that this war established and strengthened the negative relationship between the Saudis and the Egyptians in this period. And it made the Saudis more and more determined to thwart the advance of the revolution, for want of a better term. The final thing is that the Egyptians didn't really even win anyway. While North Yemen did become a republic, it became a republic with significant percentage of government officials coming from the monarchist faction. Although Muhammad al-Badr himself, the king of Mutawakkilayt Yemen, never became part of the republic and was explicitly prohibited, the Egyptians didn't get an ally controlling the entrance and exit of the Red Sea. It got a country that was lukewarm in both respects. I think this is actually a really great place to stop. As you can see, there's a lot more to go. Oh, hello. All right, so questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And while I'm waiting for those, I will explain a little bit about who we are and what we do. So this is History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. Every week, we have presentations on the Middle East hosted by yours truly. And I will discuss the second part of the Egyptian story next week at 7 p.m. We also have our discussions on Asian philosophy that are Saturdays at 7. We have European Union security that Aaron and I do periodically. We have our discussions on powerful women and dead languages, which occur once a month. And of course, we have our short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War that we will probably get back to when the war gets a little bit more active than just a siege around Bakhmut. And we have a number of older series that you can see on our YouTube. In fact, you can see any of the series that you mentioned. All those episodes are up on YouTube, which is fantastic. I think we have over 400 hours of content, and there's just so much to see and understand. So going to the chat. And by the way, if you have a question that you prefer to ask orally, please raise your hand and I'll recognize you. So at the moment, it doesn't seem like there are any questions.
Rich, I have a question.
Go ahead, Zach.
So Anwar Sadat was always an interesting character.
Sure.
Was he a Western agent or was he, Arabist? What would you call him? And then
I would say Western agent is a little strong for what he is, because he wasn't planted. But his view fundamentally was a shift away from the Arab socialism of Nasser. And as we talked about today, right? The Arab socialism of Nasser was an incredible investment of Egyptian time and power, and that was all actions that they could not take in terms of their domestic revitalization. If you're fighting a war in Yemen for 8 years, that's just money that you've lost. That's not money that's going back to the Egyptian taxpayer. And in many ways, Sadat was responding to that problem, or at least how he perceived that problem. That's not to say that the other members of the Revolutionary Command Committee felt the same way as he. did. That's just not the case. In fact, he had to sideline a number of members from that committee in order to be able to begin his westernizing reforms. And he thought through westernization, he could A, get the Sinai back, which Nasser lost in 67, and he could be able to make Egypt somewhat profitable through trade with the United States. And it worked to a certain degree, but there are significant internal issues within Egypt that he just couldn't fix in terms of how corruption works and how factories are organized, and in terms of internal arteries and all these kinds of things. But his goal was to rebuild Egypt, and he did that to a certain extent. But he didn't do it through the prism of Arab nationalism or Arab socialism. He did it through the prism of, I'm a ruler and I'm going to make certain open economic choices. Does that sort of clarify it?
Yeah, that definitely clarified. And then forget the name of the president was after him that has been running for.
Hosni Mubarak.
Hosni Mubarak was quite an interesting character. Right? He was air pilot, right? For
all of these leaders. I think Gamal Abdel Nasser might have been army. Somebody can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. But Mohammed Naguib, Anwar Sadat, and Hosni Mubarak were all from the Egyptian Air Force. They all had very high ranks in the Air Force. Hosni Mubarak in particular really became Sadat's protege because Sadat had so few supporters within the Revolutionary Command Committee. In fact, when he brought home the peace treaty with Israel, every single surviving member was opposed to it. Significant portions of the Egyptian population then and now were opposed to it. But Hosni Mubarak understood, at least Sadat's perspective on it, which was that if Egypt wanted to be a prosperous country, and if Egypt wanted to be able to pursue internal growth and development, then an alliance with the West was going to be much more profitable than an alliance with the East. And that's going to require acknowledging the existence of Israel, like it or not. And Hosni Mubarak in particular, in terms of his relationship with Israel, saw primarily their confluence of perspectives with regards to Palestine. Because from Mubarak's perspective, the PLO was a terrorist organization, and furthermore, an organization that was supporting terrorist organizations within Egypt. For example, the Sinai Bedouins in terms of their illegal weapons trafficking. And so from his perspective, it was important to coordinate with Israel. And of course, all of the stuff that we've just been talking about in this conversation now is stuff that I'm going to talk about more in depth next week. But coordination with Israel was critical for protecting Egypt's own domestic interests, not just seeing the United States as an ally.
Now, in the last presentation, Richard, you mentioned Soviets getting involved. Now, from what I know, living obviously the former Soviet Union, there was rumors that they actually declared that when Israel was moving, I think at some point was moving even faster than Nazi forces during the Russian invasion, during the Arab 1967 war, which was quite an incredible fit in the beginning. The Russians had provided the balloons, the dirigible, to blockade the Cairo, and also had threatened and contact the United States that they'll use a nuclear weapon if that doesn't stop. Have you heard anything like that in that regard, or this was just
what I was familiar with was that Israel had said that they would use a nuclear weapon if the United States wouldn't provide them military aid during the 73 war. The Soviet Union had troops on the ground in Egypt in 1970 for sure. We know during the attrition war, which Israel fought against Egypt from 1960. That Egypt fought against Israel from 1967 to 1970. That there were Soviet troops on the ground, there were Soviet advisors, and Soviets were actually manning weapons. So the Soviet Union was at war with Israel. During the 73 war, I don't believe the Soviets directly intervened the same way, but they did have military advisors in the Egyptian army. And the Israeli soldiers were on the back foot for the first couple days of the war, and then later were able to take the more aggressive position and actually cross the Suez Canal onto the Egyptian side, at which point the Soviets demanded a ceasefire to protect Egypt. And the Israelis were willing to concede because just from a logistical standpoint, Israel can't conquer Cairo. It would be a massive supply line through very difficult to control desert country. But also Cairo is a city with a population that is 3 times the population of Israel. There's no way to occupy it. They just don't have the manpower. So Israel knew that given that it was on the offensive and everything would return to a status quo antebellum, and Israel had the entire Egyptian Eighth Army encircled, they were in a very good negotiating position. So they were willing to take the ceasefire at that point. But the issue was earlier in the war where they were on the back foot. They needed American munitions in order to press the war against both the Egyptians and the Syrians.
Yeah, this is an interesting aspect. Maybe at some point, sometime in the future, I do want to do like from all the theaters and some, like we had a documentary shot back in Soviet Union where a lot of the air pilots would talk about how they fought directly with Israeli pilots and Egyptian air.
Yeah.
And it was in the open. Like it wasn't Egyptian air pilots. Maybe Nasser and 90% was all Soviets.
Yeah, no. I don't think that the rulers of the Egyptian cliques are secretly Soviet. But yes, a significant portion of the Egyptian higher quality soldiers, let's say, were either Soviet soldiers directly or under their command. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, Arabs understood, at least the ones in leadership positions, understood that they didn't have the wherewithal to guide their own militaries as successfully as Europeans could. And Europeans were including the Soviets. It's simply they didn't have the expertise. Over time, they've developed it somewhat, but I don't think anybody is going to any of the Arab militaries and proclaiming them to be geniuses in terms of military conduct. Egypt's military at this point is more effective at quashing its own population than it is at doing anything remotely external. Saudi Arabia may have the best equipment, but it might as well, but it's completely useless. They might as well drive their F-16s into the sea for the amount of training they have and how to effectively use them and strategy and the rest of it.
Right.
Which is why the 3 most powerful militaries in the Middle East are countries. That's the Iranian military, the Turkish military, and the Israeli military.
Yeah, interesting. But at that time also, just to reiterate, Russian weaponry or Soviet weaponry was pretty high tech. I mean, it's not as not as good now as we can see what's going on in Ukraine. It's just disaster. But in the 70s, it was pretty high tech, and actually, the United States was still catching up with all the MiGs and the tanks, the T-90s and whatever. But Kalashnikov was developed in 1948. I mean, who would have known? That's still used. That's how good the weapons was, and that's why a lot of the Arab nations were, especially, they were given to them for free. So why not take advantage?
No, I was going to say the other reason why the Arabs wanted Soviet weapons is because the Americans were supporting Israel. By 1967, the Americans were supporting Israel. So it was very clear that that's where it was going, and Kissinger made it pretty straightforward because he's very much a realpolitik kind of person. So he's very blunt in his assertions. His view was if the Arabs are willing to make peace with Israel, he'll facilitate them coming into the American sphere. And if they're not, well, America has made its bet in the Middle East. So that basically left open the Soviets for the Arab world. And yeah, that's basically the long and short of that. By the way, does anybody else have any questions? I don't want to just have one dominant person if other people want to ask things. Otherwise, I guess not. Zach, you want to continue? Or
No, yeah, that was just interesting, to have a conversation on this. I mean, I always was fascinated with the fact that, and again, the United States didn't support Israel, up until Israel had shown that they're able to stand on their feet, So it wasn't from the beginning, they were like, okay, well, that's nice. They played, with the fact that there's a Zionist state. Let's see how how far it goes, and Soviets helped them out first time, through Czech or European, supplement of the weapons, supply of the weapons, and then obviously, once we stood on our feet, I mean, Israelis stood on their feet, then Americans came and said, well, I mean, obviously there was a lot of tug of war. If you think of it, in the 1940s, the Jews themselves in the United States did not have much of a, I mean, regular, Jewish people. There was at one point in New York, there was a sign on restaurants, Jews and dogs and African Americans. I mean, I'm just saying African Americans, but I understand what it means, are not allowed in the restaurants. That we're talking about 1940s.
yeah,
So that was, there was a new notion to, I mean, obviously Holocaust and stuff like that.
sure, but I would say that the American support of Israel in 1967 was not motivated by some Judeophilia or some come to Jesus moment among American political leaders that Jews are somehow special or deserving of love or what have you. It was basically an understanding that Israel has a capable military, and Israel's military is in a very strategic location, and Israel's governmental style is very similar to the United States. So if we're looking for allies, which we were in the 1960s and 70s in the Cold War, Israel seems like a much safer bet. Certainly, it hasn't had any coup d'etats, which basically every other country around it has, with the exception of Jordan, which was already in the American sphere. Israel's a good place to go. That was the thought process, and it's it's not the case that anybody was making an argument about the validity or non-validity of Jewish nationalism at that point. It was primarily a realpolitik decision, and you can see that by who the supporters were and who the detractors were in the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think that way, because in the 1930s, there was a Nazi party. They had a symposiums in Madison Square Garden. So
Yeah.
I don't think there was any any support, at least from a regular, populace. Now, obviously, we have huge support from Christian groups, and they're the biggest supporters if you think of it. Even American Jews not as supportive as a lot of the Christian groups.
Well, the thing is, the Christian groups also have the numbers. If you're talking about Christians United for Israel, they basically argue that they count the 60 million evangelicals as standing behind them. Now, of course, that's hyperbole, but 60 million people, even if only a quarter of those are Israel supporting, that's more than the entire world population of Jews. It's like just from a numbers perspective, there's just a size problem. But even more so, Zionism within the American Jewish world has wavered at different points in terms of its desirability. A perfect example here, and I talked about it during the Israel presentation, or maybe I didn't, maybe it was only in my Zionism presentation all the way back in 2021. But Americans were not pro-Zionist. American Jews didn't try to fight that at all, and were generally not pro-Zionist either. Most of the early Hollywood was Jewish dominated for a variety of reasons, mostly because Jews were not allowed to work in radio. So they said, let's pick up this camera, see if it does anything. But early Hollywood films did not touch concepts of Jewishness by and large. Jews were not characters in those films. The Jews would make films about non-Jews and their struggles and whatever. But their struggles would be non-religious. They'd be economic or social, political, whatever. it wasn't until really Louis Brandeis began to popularize Zionism in America, the Supreme Court justice, that American Jews started to reevaluate whether Zionism could fit within their constellation of Jewish understanding. And the other thing you also have to realize is that before World War II, the American Jewish community saw itself as I'm trying to find the right way to say this, saw itself as a community that did not have the responsibility of carrying any form of Jewish identity. Jewish identity was a European thing in their conception. They ignored the Jews of the Arab world. And so the Jews in Germany would demonstrate what it was to be Jewish. The Jews in France, the Jews in Russia, those would be the real Jews. And we would just be people with Jewish ancestry. Maybe we go to a synagogue, maybe we don't. In fact, throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, Jews were importing rabbis from Europe. They didn't build their own seminaries until the 19-teens and 1920s. And so Judaism to them was just something that was, in the same way that an Irish American sees his Irish heritage as something that is. It doesn't mean that he's going to go to Ireland and start fighting for, the reunification of the island. It's just it's just so far removed from the center of consciousness that Zionism was just not politically interesting to American Jews until about the 1940s. And then once the state of Israel is created, you have a large upsurge of Zionism within American Jewish populations. And then, of course, as Israel becomes more right-wing in the wake of the Second Intifada, you have an increasing separation between the American Jewish community, which tends to be more left-leaning, and the Israeli community, which is increasingly more right-leaning politically. So that's sort of the situation.
And Rachel, at last, I have to ask, did you see that new exhibit in the Jewish Museum about the Sassoon family?
I haven't been to the actual exhibit itself,
Yeah.
but those are my distant cousins. And I think I hope it's going to be a fantastic exhibit. And I don't know. You and I maybe can discuss separately whether there might be something we can do with regards to either an episode or something where we sort of go through what's there. I think it's fantastic that for really the first time in a long time, we're sort of seeing a more open discussion of the Mizrahi Jewish contribution to international history, right? Because there's this sort of belief that Mizrahi Jews sort of sat on the farm or sat in the cities for the last 2,000 years and then just suddenly showed up when Israel existed. And that's not the case. Jews in the Mizrahi world were disproportionately represented in positions of authority, disproportionately represented in business, just as they were in Europe, disproportionately represented in international trade and commerce. And so it shouldn't be surprising that there's a Mizrahi Jewish family that was involved in international commerce, participated in military administration, although they themselves were not military, and were responsible for incredible feats of economic management, which is exactly what the Sassoons did. So,
yeah, definitely. We're definitely starting the Jewish series. I think Beverly is going to do a first go around, and again, I don't know how to split it, but she wants to do Ashkenazi Jews in general. But I'll probably do Bukharian Jews. I mean,
I think trying to do Ashkenazi Jews in general is going to backfire because there's just so many ways to be Ashkenazi as well. But if she thinks she can cover the differences between French Judaism, German Judaism, and Russian Judaism to put them in just big buckets, she's going to have a lot of work. But
I know it's going to be crazy I would probably just go, historical wise, maybe starting with Roman, and then moving into the Middle Ages, and then, something that we can actually materialize. And not many artifacts that had survived, but
yeah.
Stuff like that. So
anyway, I think this is a perfect time to close out. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And we shall see you next week when I finish with Nasser, walk through Sadat and Hosni Mubarak to get to the present the Arab Spring and the present rule of Egypt under Sisi.